Hello and welcome to another, I want to say another panel of the Michael Brooks Legacy Project. I am your host for this edition. My name is Brandon Sutton. I'm the host of the Discourse podcast, and I go by Pretty Bad Lefty on Twitter. And I'm being joined for this panel on technology and justice. Well, this brief rundown of a panel of on technology and justice by two wonderful guests. We have Arthur Holland Michael or Mickle, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs and author of Eyes in the Sky, The Secret Rise of Gorgon Stare and How It Will Watch Us All, and Ramesh Srinivasan, author of Beyond the Valley and professor at UCLA. Say hello, guys.
Hi, Brandon. Hi, Arthur. Nice to be with you both.
So, it's wonderful to have both of you. I had the pleasure of listening to both of your interviews with Michael Brooks on the Michael Brooks Show. And you have many ideas, many points of similarities in the work that you're doing in terms of technology and the modern era. So I just wanted to take this time to get the audiences acquainted with you or reacquainted with you if they haven't listened to the episodes with you and Michael yet, and get you two acquainted with each other so we can just sort of, find these overlaps to begin with and move organically through that. So let's start with Arthur. When you were on Michael's show late 2019, you were introducing your latest book, Eyes in the Sky. Can you just sort of bring us back to that moment, right? Bring us back to the point where Eyes in the Sky is coming out. Enemy of the State is being referenced in your book because it certainly wasn't coming out in 2019, and you're discussing the sort of burgeoning realization that the surveillance state is going out of control. So what did you and Michael talk about then?
Yeah, so we spoke a couple of months after the book came out. The way it actually came about is I met Dave Griscom at a party on I think it was Randall's Island in New York, and I was telling him a little bit about my work on surveillance and about the book, and he told me, that he'd be potentially interested in having me on the show, which was like a huge deal for me, and I got super excited, and we ended up making it happen, which was such a thrill, and it was a wonderful conversation. Essentially, what the book is about is the kind of rise of these very powerful aerial surveillance technologies, which, as compared to earlier aerial spying systems, can watch incredibly large areas all at once. You can kind of imagine if you had Google Earth of a whole city, but it was live moving Google Earth. And it was a technology that was very little understood. It had a very sort of mysterious and secret history. It was used extensively in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then later in Syria. And then, at the time that I was writing the book, it was seeing increasing use domestically in the United States. And it was a kind of eye-opening realization that this was a future that we were sort of staring down. And so, Michael and I spoke about that. It was a fantastic conversation. I like to think of, interviewers as kind of dance partners. And if you have a really good dance partner, they make you look like a good dancer yourself. That even if you're a novice, you look like you know what you're doing. And Michael was very much in that category. He knew how to move me and push me and to think about a bigger picture and think about implications of what I'd written about that went beyond the book in terms of things like foreign policy and colonialism and that was great. And you wanted to put a sort of a bit of a historical spin on this. I mean, in the year or so since that conversation, it's been especially eye-opening to see how a lot of the things that were imagined in that book became a reality in pretty stark and frightening ways. that's a little brief overview. Hopefully that gets you a little situated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm going to apologize already because I plan on stepping on your feet a lot if we're going to continue with the dance metaphor, because I am bad at dancing, uh, analogy or no. Yes, absolutely. And I appreciated that you started your conversation with Michael when I listened to the interview with he's sort of grounding it in the sort of popular culture aspect of it. I think that was a good hook, right? So you talk about in the interview the idea of enemy of the state, this popular Will Smith late 90s you know action thriller vehicle. There were a lot of them. There was The Fugitive with I think they both actually had Tommy Lee Jones in them. And it's not only just because the movie is this parallel for the security state, but also because it's, we've entered the age where science fiction is now inspiring things. It's not just,
Yeah.
Philip C. Clark is predicting with Minority Report predictive profiling. Now, no, actually people in the CIA are reading reading 1984, reading Minority Report and going like, yes, actually this is a great idea. I can't believe no one's working on like psychics yet. Or I mean, the CIA is definitely, the FBI is definitely working on psychics, but assumingly they haven't advanced that technology quite yet. But I want to jump over to Ramesh, right? So I believe you also spoke with Michael in late 2000, late 2000, or 2010. I'm sorry, November 10th, late 2019. You spoke with Michael regarding both your work on your book Beyond the Valley, but also you being in the process of becoming a Bernie surrogate, going into sort of the primary at the time. So sort of let's just go back for a moment to 2019. Everyone is happy. The Bernie the Bernie momentum is coming. It looks like there's hope. The Central Park executions are on the horizon. We've been promised them. And you're on the Michael Brooks show. You're talking about this idea of technology and culture, these ideas surrounding the synchronization between Silicon Valley and the national security state, and sort of the role in which Silicon Valley has played historically, and I would say shaping the narrative regarding Silicon Valley. And just like let's just start briefly going back to that. I mean, that was obviously a lot, but let's talk briefly about your relationship with Michael Brooks, how you ended up on the show, and how you ended up talking about that topic with him.
I found Michael to be remarkable. I mean, he was so intellectually curious. He was so global in his scope, which we don't see much amongst progressive, folks in the media here in the United States, even though I think there's a desire for that in the progressive media community. And Michael wanted to chop it up with me about leftist theories and for example, Gramsci. I mean, I just found hanging out with him and speaking with him and communicating with him to be incredibly refreshing and generative. The guy had so much energy, which is something I really resonate with because he was inspired. And so it's such an honor to join you guys and to be a small part of celebrating Michael. So in my own case, I've been looking at relationships between technologies and people's power for decades, for 20 plus years, in the context of field work and DIY collaborations with indigenous peoples in different parts of the United States and across the global South, in the context of the Egyptian Revolution, where I was based for about 3 summers, to full disclosure, not while I was teaching at UCLA. And also in the context of increasingly my work is really concerned with how technology doesn't exist in its own prism. It is the language and the modality by which pretty much every aspect of human possibility is foreclosed or opened up, largely foreclosed, to kind of think about Judith Butler and her arguments about the foreclosure of possibility, the foreclosure of identity. So when we're talking about banking, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about insurance, we're talking about racial justice issues, talking about the criminal injustice system, prison pipeline, prison industrial system, all of it. It's interwoven through digital technology. So you no longer can talk about technology as merely Silicon Valley or big tech. You have to talk about power on all forms. And Michael got that. And that was so cool to talk with him about those ideas. And a lot of my work as a progressive is about how do we transform that system? How do we shift our lenses of analysis to look at different ways, different modalities by which technologies are supporting other kinds of value systems, whether they're cultural ones or they're justice-oriented ones or the revolutionary ones, which I know he was super into. So we met in that context, but also because I've been chopping it up with the Young Turks, my friends here in LA, and hosting for them. Though I'm not like a young Turk, but like I've been hanging out and doing stuff with them since 2012, so a long time, you know. And Anna Kasparian and I are pretty good friends. It really, or like have that connection and that kind of way of looking at things. And Anna, when my last book came out, did book events with me. And you know, I think I was on Anna's show, and I had been listening to Michael's show for a while. And I was super impressed with its global scope, actually. And when he hit me up being like, would you like to be on? I was like, oh, are you kidding, man? Like, it would be an honor. So, you know, Michael is one of those incredibly important people that we see spanning, you know, the places of the worlds of media, but really all about opening up consciousness so we can look at how we can resituate the questions of who has power over these technologies that are now so intimately part of every aspect of our lives.
No, absolutely. And, you know, Michael was someone who always impressed me by was there just not only curiosity, but wide range of knowledge. I lack that knowledge and that curiosity, but I make up for it with being incredibly, you know, inquisitive. Somebody say annoying. So, you know, to that regard, and also to the ostensible topic of the panel, you know, I would like to, and I think this is a good starting point for people who hear the word bandied around and they generally know what it means, but just sort of hash out little, like, what do we mean when we talk about technology, right? Because, you know, from my background as an anthropologist, technology is everything. You know, technology is your clothes. Technology is like a rock that you use to smash open, you know, a clam. That's technology, right? You know, in many ways, it's what separates us from animals and some old fashioned ideas regarding, you know, teleological evolution, etc. Right? But when we talk about technology in the modern era, I think that we are talking about a very specific band of, you know, digital technology, internet technology, etc. So if you guys could just speak to in your work, maybe Ramesh, 'cause I know in your specific interview with Michael, you had a very sort of interesting way of interweaving technology and culture, which is, you know, some would say technology is culture, right? And especially when we're talking about humanity. You know, like, let's just start there. Let's talk about, like, what do we mean when we talk about technology in 2020, right? 2021 rather.
Yeah, you're right, Brandon. Such a good question. You know, when people speak about the term technology today, they're mainly talking about the internet, AI, machine learning, big data, surveillance kinds of issues, cryptocurrencies, etc. Right? Digital data, you know, basically surveillance technologies for the most part, right? Like ones. However, you know, kind of and Michael was really interested in this. I remember speaking with him about this, but on interview and just sort of like chopping it up with him about it. I really vibe with what you're saying there, Brandon. The kind of the sort of legacies of not only Western liberalism, but kind of Enlightenment thinking in and of itself built this kind of false binary between the biological and the technological, the human and the technological, and really the relationship between things and beings and animals and humans. And in many pre-colonial communities, and even to this day in indigenous contexts, in sub-Saharan African contexts, in places where I have done kind of DIY collaborative field work, where basically my work in those cases is about building and creating stuff with people that advances their agendas, their own sovereignty, their own autonomy, maybe their own movements, and just being of service to that and writing about that process rather than writing about them. You know, that's kind of the way I situate my work ethnographically. And so when we look at that, technology no longer is its own prism. Technology is humanity. Humanity and technology are interwoven. Like this kind of idea of technology as merely something that is socially or politically constructed. I love that kind of idea from the STS world, science technology studies world, but I don't think it fully breaks down what you're saying, right? Which is that that binary is a false binary in many different cases. They're not discrete necessarily. And so in this sense, I just want to shout out a philosopher who I'm paying a lot of attention to, named Achille Mbembe. And I know Mike was into him. Mbembe is his last name. And Achille, who's a Cameroonian scholar who is, looks at these kind of, and it is really like a Foucauldian in many ways, but in his critique, but he's really looking hard at these kind of new forms of new forms of animism, almost like new ways of thinking about beings and technologies, and in a sense, there's something very optimistic and vibrant in that mode of analysis. So because a big part of the colonial world within which we live is the destruction of alternate imaginaries and ways of being.
No, absolutely. And, just to your point there, I think that when you're talking about this is a binary between this false binary that was constructed with colonialism, you're also talking about this sort of false hierarchy of technology, right? We're talking about internet technology specifically in the context of this panel, but we know that that's treated within the Western paradigm as though the pinnacle of technology, right? We compare having the internet to countries without the internet to demonstrate how we have progressed beyond that, this sort of first world, third world divide. Sort of building on that, I want to draw Arthur in here because when you talked with Michael, a lot of your conversation was built around the sort of escalating drone warfare, right? Which your book was, rather, the escalation of drone warfare from the Bush to Obama to the Trump administrations, sort of with the context of your book and the drones being part of surveillance and drone technology being largely drone technology still being kind of part of this new tech wave, right? Drones are the new age of tech. So my question to you would be, when we're talking about technology and how we define it for the purposes of this panel, how do you feel like, how does technology, rather the language of high technology that has become so hegemonic when we talk about the values of Western society, because obfuscate the dangers that are produced by not necessarily tech itself, but how we use the tech, right? So we're talking about technology and digital age, the internet age, and then we talk about something like drone warfare, drones, which have become everything from how we film movies to how we conduct investigations to how we do warfare, right? And I think when I was listening to your interview, I'm going long now, I was listening to your interview, the idea of how technology and the sort of the inherent morality, the inherent not neutrality, but not just neutrality, but the inherent righteousness of progressing technology under this definition, it's a very strict definition, becomes a justification for all sorts of things. But I packed that full. Sorry for that.
No. That's great. You're giving me you're giving me a lot of rope to work with. It's so there are a couple of pieces here. One is that I would say in terms of framing technology, because you need some kind of framing, you can't refer to a rock as technology if you want to have a sort of focused conversation, is to think about technology as possibility, right? When a technology becomes normalized, it kind of fades into the background. And so the technologies that I talk about and write about are often forward-looking issues, technologies that are on the cusp of emerging. And what we're trying to figure out is what we're going to do when these possibilities become realities, right? Which goes to the heart of what you're saying, because the conversation that often comes up with regards to technologies like the ones I wrote about in the book, or like drones, is this issue of the neutrality of technology. And the conversation that you hear over and over again is people saying, well, yes, surveillance technology or drones or anything else can be used for negative purposes, but it can also be used for positive purposes, right? And that assumes that there is an inherent intrinsic neutrality to the technology. But I think that's not a particularly helpful way of looking at it, because as you pointed out, and Ramesh pointed out, and Michael often pointed out, we don't live in a neutral world. And these inequalities and discrepancies and injustices are automatically by default embedded in any technologies that we bring out into the world. And so when you talk about a technology, you have to talk about and think about the structures, the societal issues that will make up its environment and that will motivate its use, right? I think it's really, really important to think about that. And that's why it's, when you have a conversation about these things, you do have to be curious about these pieces that perhaps people don't want to think about and engage with because they're dark and they're difficult, which goes to this last piece of your question, the notion of the kind of noble pursuit of technology, seeing technology as an end in itself, right? This kind of engineering view that, well, I'm just an engineer, I make the technology and it goes out into the world and, it's sort of other people's problem, perhaps. It actually goes to a very interesting element of the story in the book, which was that this technology originally, as you pointed out, inspired directly by that movie, Enemy of the State. Literally an engineer who worked for the government was watching that movie, saw this like crazy surveillance satellite that was fictional in the movie and thought, oh, maybe we should go ahead and build that. The development cycle of that technology was propelled in the early 2000s by the experiences in Iraq and later Afghanistan with improvised explosive devices, which were having a heavy toll on US and allied forces in the local civilian population. And different intelligence agencies and the military thought that this surveillance technology would be a great way of finding the people who are planting those bombs. And so the engineers who were involved felt as though they were on this really important quest to save lives. As one of them put it to me, he felt like every day that they delayed was another day that people were dying as a result of attacks that could be prevented if that technology was in the field. And it was only once the technology came out and became a real manifested thing in the world that they realized that the Pandora's box had been opened, and they started thinking about the implications of what they had done, and this kind of harrowing realization that you can't put it back in, and now it's in the world, and that's something that has to sit with them and everybody, because now we live with this stuff. It's never as simple as we might like to think it is. You have to consider all the elements. If only we could think about all those elements throughout the development process and not just hurrying to respond as they emerge.
Yeah, I mean, if only people could watch Jurassic Park, because that's the whole plot of Jurassic Park. But that's actually why I love listening to Michael's show, not necessarily because of the dinosaur references, but because, it helped me develop my own ideas. And so even listening to you guys is helping me develop more ideas. And, going back to what you were saying, Arthur, just now, and also drawing back to Ramesh's first conversation with Michael, it just makes me think of how deeply and intrinsically intertwined, like, the language and values of the very specific, internet age tech world, tech company have become sort of the standardized values of a large swath of our, world, of certainly of America, right? And part of it, I think that, what that means is that we have this kind of not only ideology that surrounds the inherent neutrality and therefore maybe inherent moral imperative to develop and progress technologically speaking in ways that are obviously influenced by and defined by Western hegemonic standards. But it, A, encourages us to interpret the rest of the world that way, but B, it encourages us to sort of view this new ideology of technology as inherently exculpatory in and of itself. Like, we have to make it so therefore, any consequence of it being made is, it has to exist out there. It has to exist. If it can exist, it has to exist. And also if it can be modeled or made algorithmically, if it can be visualized algorithmically, a la sort of Nate Silver, it's scientifically and therefore socially relevant and has an inherent social and scientific weight. So, we've switched to this entire paradigm where this not even real language of technology, as we've mentioned before, in the broad, holistic sense, or like language or value system of science in the broad, holistic sense, is what is defining our society, but more of a very shallow, bastardized, heavily curated version of technology and science has come to define our value systems, and one that, benefits not only Western hegemony, generally speaking, but a very narrow slice of the top, earners within, Western hegemonic, Western society. So your tech billionaires, your tech oligarchs, who, become our folk heroes, right? They become our Iron Man.
I have several thoughts about that. That's I totally hear you, and I like what you just had to say, Brandon. First of all, as we sit through this pandemic, we see precarity in many different aspects of our lives in terms of climate issues, this pandemic and future pandemics, economic precarity, many forms of precarity, right? Look at where the wealth has gone. It's gone to those who are controlling the pipes and languages of pretty much every aspect of human experience, right? Through these digital media languages and platforms, right? Massive amounts, hundreds of billions of dollars have been accumulated out of a situation that was already deeply extractive and unequal and unjust to Bezos, Musk, Zuckerberg, I'm naming names, Gates, etc. Look also at how Andrew Cuomo and the state of New York, Democratic, right? Governor, basically rolled out a red carpet, blue ribbon task force for the future of many things New York, especially education, and kind of handed it over to Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, and Gates and others, right? So just to that last point you made, you can see how we have elevated these tech oligarchs who are making more money than ever before, partly because we call them tech people. We've elevated them into almost this kind of heroic auteur, heroic inventor. We've mythologized Elon Musk, who's now the wealthiest person in the world. And the question really is why? Do we mythologize those who are running big pharma and oil companies, or people who are high up in the military industrial complex? They're kind of more anonymous, or bankers, So there's something very interesting about that. And so why do we see that spectacular capturing of the imagination, the imaginary associated with it? Partly because associated with technology has been not just a massive branding campaign, but a hijacking of discourse. And I think this is what you're talking about, or at least how I resonate with it. Innovation, disruption, always forward moving, always instrumental. These are teleologies or I would even say they're ideologies that are encoded into our kind of collective discourse around technology itself. And part of why I do the work I do, and it's so inspiring to me, and why I remain so extremely optimistic and progressive about these issues, is I have seen firsthand, and I know Michael and I talked about this, a whole other set of viewpoints and ways of being in relation to quote unquote technology, right? Like I've given examples of collectivist discourses influencing the design of technology, collective models of building and designing technology, collective models of ownership, right? Technology is used in a tactical and subversive way as part of a revolutionary movement. Workers taking power over digital application gig platforms so that they are the ones who benefit from it. In the Sanders campaign, we wrote policies that were all about supporting indigenous communities, local communities, rural communities, so that they could control the pipes, they could control the ISPs and make a lot more money, because we get the worst internet service in the so-called wealthy world at much higher prices. By the way, if you look at the bandwidth per cost that we pay for our pipe access of mobile data and internet data, it's 12 times worse than the Republic of South Korea and several times worse than Western Europe. So it's this extractive, draconian, oligarchic system of political economy that's layered on top of technology, combined with the hijacking of discourse and the mythologization of people who are, quite frankly, pretty have a pretty existential and maybe even nihilistic viewpoint of the future of our species, right? Look at all these post-apocalyptic bunkers that are being invested in by Peter Thiel, Sequoia Capital, right? Like he was an advisor for Trump, right? And so it's just important to understand that that Silicon Valley has managed to evade a lot of this kind of analytical, ideological analysis. And now it's getting some attention because it's so clumsily dealing with our political situation.
So I think, yeah, the marriage between Silicon Valley and the domestic spying state, the foreign spying state, is where there's a lot of overlap between both your work, Ramesh, and Arthur's work. So I'd love to get Arthur in here, sort of, touch on some of those points, especially as it relates to this idea of like Silicon Valley and the image it crafts for itself within, our society, basically, right? As we can agree that our society has been allowed to be largely shaped by these burgeoning technologies, shape how we do sociality, shape how we do, shape how we do intimacy, shape how we do business, shape how we do sort of self-sufficiency, especially with the coronavirus pandemic. We see more people moving towards online. So I would love to get both of your ideas, but starting with Arthur, on the role of Silicon Valley, both in relation to that and also relation moving to the future.
Yeah, I mean, I really do hope that people look at what has happened with digital technologies in the last couple of years and use it as a template for what to avoid with future iterations of technological transformation, right? Because going back to what I said earlier about how technology doesn't emerge in a void, these technologies, digital technologies, social media, communication, emerged in a deeply unequal world where power and money had ultimate currency. And so it really should have come as no surprise that in creating power and creating currency, these technologies would create structures that would want to perpetuate themselves and that would want to hold on to power. To me, it's a natural evolution. I don't subscribe to the notion that there was a sort of evil grand plan. This is just what happens when a technology, be it a surveillance technology or a dating app, creates immense power, right? And I think getting ahead of the creation of power, in the form of perhaps regulation or just a level of sort of self-reflection is really important, because it's hard to it's easier, I think it should be easier to be proactive than than reactive. But it's a tough one, because it's really hard to see these things coming, in a sense, and these things also get distorted. I mean, I remember, back in the early days of Facebook, tagging all my friends in pictures, just with careless abandon, just this is the greatest thing ever. Not knowing that what I was essentially doing was database tagging for what would become some very, very powerful facial recognition systems, right? Now, I was 17 or 16 or whatever, so I shouldn't have known better I couldn't necessarily have known better anyway. But, I think we should also give our former selves, or ourselves of 15 years ago, a little slack, because, we were all optimistic in a way about this stuff. But now we've learned our lesson. I think that's what I'm really trying to get at here, is that there is a continuing rapid pace of technology evolution, and we shouldn't look at future evolutions, with the kind of the same optimism perhaps that we had about social media, especially if we can see those creation of new types of power coming down the horizon, which is not to say that we shouldn't be optimistic about the future of how technology can be controlled, because in that sense, I'm totally with Ramesh. I'm hugely optimistic about what we can do. because we're seeing a discussion about these very issues, right? We're seeing a discussion about how, inequality in tech companies is one of the core root causes of inequality in products, right? That's not a discussion that was happening in the early days of these technologies emerging. So we made a huge step in the right direction. It's a question of keeping, I think, the keeping up the tempo and not just being blinded by the dazzle of new technologies that emerge with all their possibilities.
I totally agree. Yeah. Can I just say something super
quick? Go ahead. Of course.
I think it just gives me an opportunity to mention one thing that Michael and I used to talk about a little bit, which is how there's a certain, when we look at the history of the internet, I feel like Arthur was just alluding to this. We saw kind of a couple things. First of all, the internet was publicly funded by US taxpayers. Yes, it was DARPA funding, a military funding, but it was US taxpayers. As we know, a massive amount of our taxes go to support the military and therefore the military industrial complex. And so we American people paid for the architecture of the internet. Without that architecture, just like without these roads right outside my place, Amazon, Google, all of them would be worthless, not worth a penny. So they owe the public because they're worth nothing without the public, right? So and there's that model, and Bernie used to talk about it, not around tech, but around larger issues, which is, privatizing all the profits and value and socializing all the costs, right? And so as their privatized greed became bigger and bigger and bigger, they made a bunch of mistakes, with disinformation, with absence of algorithmic transparency, et cetera, with racist AI. These are all things we can talk more about. And the cost got reborn onto society. But that early internet was not only public, but it started in a kind of communitarian way. All these online news groups, Usenet forums. You all remember the story of the Zapatistas, right? Which was not simply about the internet, but the internet was appropriated as a mode of globalizing the struggle and making it not just about a place-based movement in Chiapas, right? Things moved out of there. So I just want to make that point that there have always been collectivist models of being that have been associated with this digital technology world. And I think it's important for us to remember those at this time.
No, absolutely. I think it's a great point, Ramesh. And just to touch briefly on what, Arthur said before we move forward, absolutely. I cut myself slack all the time for all my mistakes. That's just the way I roll. And it was easy to make that mistake, I think, because if you were operating not from the investor standpoint when it came to the internet, but from just the everyday average user, the internet was being better. The 90s tech boom didn't really affect the everyday average 13-year-old or 14-year-old in 2008 the way it did, their parents or their grandparents possibly in the decade before. So it was easy to believe, I think, the hype that Facebook was going to revolutionize, how we kept in touch with people, the invention of FOMO, right? The invention of the idea that if you're not on Facebook, you're going to be missing out on the conversation. And that speaks to what I think Arthur was hinting at, and also what Arthur was saying, and also what you were sort of tangentially reaching as well, Ramesh, is that some, power, I think, by strategic basically goal has been obscured from the American people. And since they don't necessarily know how to interpret what's going on in terms of understand and unpack, power, right? So instead, I say that to basically as an example, we talk about Facebook coming out and claiming they're going to revolutionize the way you keep in contact, the way you keep in contact with your friends, the way you remember things. And they didn't revolutionize it. They just changed the way it worked. They made you do it the way Facebook wanted to do it. And they got you to adopt Facebook's values about what it meant to remember things, what it meant to be involved in conversations. And that's what power is. That's the hegemony. But, we've had that sort of analysis of power removed from us, on purpose. And so it was easy to fall into the trap of Facebook. It was easy not to realize how your definition of friends was changing to fit Facebook, what benefited Facebook's algorithm, what made it possible for Facebook to, benefit from friendship versus benefiting you, right? Because that was just the goal, right? And I think going back to something that, if I'm not mistaken, Ramesh spoke about with Michael, this idea of these tech companies, not as, people who sell services or goods, but just platforms. They're just neutral platforms. Not only the technology neutral, but these tech companies, they just host it. They're just putting you in contact with other people and facilitating relationships, business, sex, friendship, relationship. And the product is, not to be sort of crack, but you're the product. Your data is the product. And, people make fun of Moviefone, but like Moviefone is like one of the only companies that sold you something in receipt for your data. Facebook just gives you depression when they sell your data. When they sort of run these weird, psychological experiments on you to shape the way you think, they don't even give you free movie tickets. But Moviefone, my favorite tech company, which, RIP movie theaters, they used to sort of take that. And people, when they wondered how Moviefone was able to give people tickets, it was like, well, because they're selling your data. And I think now people are sort of realizing that's just, that's not the exception, that's the rule. It's not the exception to the conversation. Moviefone is not the exception, except for going out of business because they actually offer people something for their data. The rule is that they violate your privacy and sell your data. And that's kind of how, we are, I think, in my opinion, that's what we're seeing people's mindset shift towards. Like, not tech companies and the pandemic has changed, but, a more wary eye towards tech companies as not these sort of neutral arbiters or neutral platforms, but like actually companies that are trying to monetize your experience for their own benefit.
Can I jump in really quickly, on something that you said, which is this notion of the transaction? In a way, everything that we're talking about today is about transactions, whether we're talking about a social media platform or indeed surveillance, right? We're talking about a transaction between two parties. And I think, perhaps, just hear me out on this, the issue is that in so many of these cases, the citizen is not really totally aware of everything that's at play in that transaction. They maybe have a sense of what they're getting, but they don't have a sense of what they're giving back. I've been thinking a lot recently about the notion of frictionlessness, right? I mean, so much of what digital technologies enable is just things to not have friction, right? Ordering a cab no longer has any friction because you can just do it on your phone. Same really in a way with surveillance technologies, right? If you have a really powerful surveillance technology, you have less, police walking around on the street, right? So there's sort of less visible friction. And I don't think citizens are really aware of the price that they're paying for that reduction in friction, right? Well, the safety that they get in this transaction with the government agency in question, they give something back, and maybe it's an abstract thing, but this gets to my concluding point that I always get to with regards to surveillance technologies is the importance of transparency. People need to understand what is the give and take in this transaction so they can decide whether it's worth it to them, or whether there's perhaps a fairer transaction, or whether there should be rules in place to govern that transaction, rather than just accepting the terms as they are given to them, usually in the form of a very, very long terms of agreement form, or a government program that you maybe only find out about through a freedom of information request if you know how to do one of those.
30 years later, if you're lucky, depending on what the program actually was. But, I think we're running on the end of time. I want to let Ramesh get the last word in here because I know we have to go. Just to your point, briefly, I agree with you. And I think that, part of that for me is the logical extension of the goal of neoliberal politics, broadly speaking, which is to erase institutions, from the eyes of rather to erase institutions and more specifically erase the ostensible role of them, so that individual citizens are left within this sort of mire of, rugged individuality, right? It's not so much about necessarily, it's not only about removing the police from sight, but people should not, rather removing the police from sight is, I think, part of a logical step from the idea of like, you can't really actually count on the police. like the idea the police are not actually responsible to you in the same way that these tech companies try to erase their sort of presence from what is obviously the transaction between you and, you know, whoever's on the other end of your DM. Right. So, but I think we've seen wholesale as a result of neoliberal politics, and which tech companies I think within America represents the sort of pinnacle of both like prestige and sometimes wealth, is that, you know, we've allowed power to erase themselves and erase powerful institutions from the sort of the overview of citizens, and even just erase that they have any particular responsibility, either to like their customers in the case of, you know, tech website or whatever, or to their constituents in the case of, you know, elected official or body. So it's just like, okay, out of sight, out of mind, out of responsibility. And then responsibility can be diffused. It can be diffused amongst the entire bureaucracy, or it can be diffused amongst the entire population. You know, then it becomes your fault. It's not, you know, Mark Zuckerberg's fault. It's everyone at Facebook's fault, or it's everyone who signed up but didn't read the term of service's fault. So like, no, like, it's, I think, you know, part of the erasure is about making sure fault is as difficult to lay on any particular powerful figure as possible, and can in turn be laid on the least powerful to, you know, again, enforce this internalized meritocracy. But sorry, I went on there a little bit long. Ramesh, please, why don't you close us out with your ideas on this topic?
Yeah, and like super psyched to join you both. This was really fun, and I hope we can continue doing it. Like a pleasure, Arthur, and also Brandon. Great job bringing us together. And down to do this anytime in honor of Michael, you know, and more. So yeah, one of the things I think Arthur made a great point about how the transactions that we enter into are often obfuscated from us, right? And those are transactions that also exist in relation to citizenry and surveillance and privacy kinds of issues. But those are also transactions that are associated with, you know, when there is a transaction occurring when we log on to WhatsApp or log on to Facebook or log on to Amazon. And those transactions both exist on the sort of like transient level of the user and the platform, but there are far deeper transactions. There are transactions about the extraction of data, the collection of data, the retention of data, the aggregation of data, like with credit card records, right? All of these kinds of issues. And so what we've been offered are experiences that seem frictionless, and where, as you said really brilliantly just now, Brandon, where there's a diffusion of so-called accountability and responsibility, where we're just kind of like totally in the dark and not really sure what to do. And we've kind of like just kind of, and I'm not really interested in blame or fault or any of these things, but more like it's kind of just a situation where we're all just kind of in a morass. We're all just kind of heads under the sand. And clearly not all of us, but there are some who know what's going on and are being you know, opaque about those issues. And that kind of system always produces more pain and more harm upon those who are most vulnerable: Black and brown people, racialized capitalism, you know, working class people, peoples in the global South. And one last thing I just want to say, which is I think what's really connecting all of our thoughts, or just at least my sense of it, is, you know, and this is kind of a dilemma that we exist within this particular mode of capitalist society that we enter into, which is really like a kind of zombified capitalism, as Yanis Varoufakis puts it. You know, companies like Uber are worth hundreds of billions of dollars and are not profitable, right? Like, what's going on here? We saw with GameStop, like it's a zombie system, the equity valuation markets, right? So what we are at, I think, is where we think we're entering into these hermetic, like smooth transactions all the time, even though we don't know what's going on, but all the costs are externalized, you know, mining in the Congo of coltan, which enters into these phones, lithium in Bolivia, labor practices in Foxconn in China, the content moderators, you know, who are looking for dick pics and so on. I just needed to say that. And are traumatized by that in the Philippines, right? Call center workers who are awake at night while everyone else is sleeping. While everyone else in their societies are sleeping, having massive effects on their fMRI scans and vitamin D. So we think we're entering into this efficient, smooth, disruptive, innovative world, but if anything, all the costs of this extractive system are just being spilled out, and they're being called, we think of them as externalities, but they're more and more than ever before materializing. So that's why here's a huge opportunity. In every sort of system of collapse, there are opportunities for renewal and reimagination. And I'm not just being like hippie philosophical there. I see examples of that in action, and I write about them in my book. And I'm continuing to write about them.
So I know, Ramesh, you were with us for part one of this panel. So let's start with an introduction of Kirsten. And currently, I believe you are a PhD candidate in politics at York University. And what are you specializing in?
I am in the final stages of completing the dissertation, going on wood. And my project is essentially looking at international humanitarian law, so the laws of war and the use of armed drones. I am trying to kind of see how they're being used in armed conflict context versus the kind of much more popular analysis around, targeted killings and whatnot, and essentially trying to see what drones can actually tell us about that legal regime. And so I'm kind of broadly using post-colonial criticisms and theories to kind of tease that out and essentially examine what our ideas of war are like versus the realities, and how drones really can reveal that paradox.
Very interesting, and that's a very good way to tie it into our sort of technology aspect of this. I will say, this isn't a contest, but I am also a PhD candidate. I did not finish my dissertation, so you've won this contest, which is why it's not a contest. So congratulations on that. And just as a reminder for our audience who have not heard your panel with Michael on the show before, which I'm sure we will link in sort of the description of this sort of panel. What did you discuss with Michael when you were on? I believe 2019. It was in relation to some developments in human rights and human rights law.
Yeah, so it was more of a primer in international law's history. So kind of looking at the political and largely colonial context in which what we now recognize as international law were sort of formed. And so it was in those colonial encounters, and basically trying to unpack the embedded value systems and under the theoretical assumptions that underpin international law, and trying to tease out how those remain in international law today. And so this is actually a great kind of follow-up to that, because that was taking a much more kind of broad scope of international law's history. And here we can maybe almost narrow it down a little bit more to specifically, how it's being used with particular technologies and weapons.
That sounds wonderful. Hopefully we will do that. And I will just say, if you haven't listened to the interview that Michael did with Kirsten before, I would highly recommend it. I listened to it in preparation for this one. I didn't understand a lot what they were talking about, but hopefully I can get my questions answered during this hour or so. And if you did watch our first panel on information, or rather on technology and justice, which I don't see how you got to the second one and didn't watch the first one. So, pause if you have and go back to the first one just to be on track, really, honestly. This man needs no introduction. Ramesh Srinivasan, author of Beyond the Valley, a professor of information studies at UCLA. Say hello to our audience once again, Ramesh.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Brandon. Hi, Kirsten. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you both. And Kirsten, first time, and Brandon, great to be in conversation with you again.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled. Ramesh is thrilled. I hope Kirsten is thrilled. Some of the audience is probably thrilled.
I'm thrilled.
Yeah, hopefully the energy is infectious. So we started our first panel, or rather our first part of the panel on technology and justice, with sort of a brief, working definition of technology. So I think, in order to parallel that, right, it'd be good to start this one with a sort of a brief, a brief working definition what we mean when we talk about justice, right? And maybe within that sort of distinguish it from, the law, right? Because I think as we talk about Kirsten's specialty in international law and human rights and some of these big topics, and also when we talk about sort of the distinction between what's right and what gets punished and what gets allowed to continue, we see these distinctions rise up a lot. So let's start with Kirsten.
Yeah, it's funny because if you say the word justice, I think it evokes a lot of different images for people. And, something like a criminal justice system might come to mind. And I think that, law and justice are obviously very closely interrelated. And you could consider one as like an institutional attempt to pursue the other. But the thing about is the authority of law, I think, encourages people to treat it as if it is definitionally just, right? And it also discourages people from challenging its application or even its kind of basic precepts. And so I think that's like kind of a great starting point, and being like, okay, like, are they, like, what do they have in similar, what do they have in common? What is maybe kind of lacking from the other? And as I kind of have said in this interview that I did with Michael before, the question of law's apparent neutrality needs to be interrogated, particularly since it's often kind of the developmental context is usually hollowed out of those conversations.
Absolutely. Ramesh, do you have anything particular you wanted to jump on that Kirsten said, or?
Yeah, sure. Well, I really appreciate what Kirsten just said. Much of my work over, I don't know, almost the past 20 years or so has been, these days it's been more focused on legislative transformations, and ways of kind of going really like singularly after techno-capitalism more largely. But, my heart and my spirit comes out of community-based work that I've done for a very long time with indigenous peoples and communities, with Egyptian revolutionaries, and with communities who are interested in articulations of their own voices and values, partly in relation to technology, but technology is simply sort of a layer onto which something far more profound is being expressed, which is, belief systems about territory, belief systems about speech acts and voice and value systems, and questions of sovereignty around economic rights and human rights more largely. And so, I look often at this kind of concept of justice in a sort of bottom-up fashion based on the experiences I have working with different peoples, and their expressions and articulations and aspirations toward justice tend to be fairly specific yet extremely profound. In the case of Egypt, it was where I was doing fieldwork for 3 years, amidst all of the mind-blowing experience of being in the Arab world during these revolutions. People were talking about the right to live with dignity, So in that sense, an articulation of justice was about an expression of those rights, which all human beings deserve. In the case of my fieldwork that I'm currently doing quite a bit with Zapotec and Mixtec and Mixe communities in southern Mexico, and a little bit in Chiapas with kids of Zapatistas, for example. In those cases, justice is about marking territory partly through technology, which is really interesting, and concepts of what they call autonomia and sovereignty and so on. So the point I'm trying to make is, justice to me is like as profound as the expression of being itself, the expression of who we are, our identity. And it exists within, I would argue, a neo-colonial framework, which often is masked by various forms, and here's a nice fancy word, neoliberal extractivism, right? So like this, so justice I sort of see when I attend strikes of Uber workers in Kenya who are trying to protest against a company that's 8,000 miles away, or this kind of idea of what does justice look like for someone to protest a drone that might be several thousand feet above their heads in the sky. So on the one hand, it's about the expressions of aspirations and beings and being and rights. But on the other hand, it's also about the attempts to affect change and greater amounts of self and collective determination.
No, absolutely. And, a lot of great stuff was just said. I want to just sort of pull one thing out because I think it's, not only is it important because of its intrinsic nature, or rather because justice is intrinsically tied to the concept, but also because it is a good parallel to our discussion with technology. And that's specifically the idea of justice as being, essentially culturally mediated or culturally determined, being specific to certain contexts in certain places and time. And this sort of the goal of a modern form of colonial justice, colonial society, as pretending as though justice is objective or being implied objective, can be applied objectively across the globe through this lens, in the same way that we might say that like this idea of Western technology being devoid of its contextual being devoid of people being unwilling to examine the context in which the technology arises in. People are also being unwilling to examine the technology where these sort of pretenses of justice, these sort of structures of justice that we have currently legitimated within Western society are, being created within, right? So this sort of dual idea of objectivity in technology and dual idea of objectivity in justice being both rooted in kind of this Western supremacy that we have the right to enforce both paradigms of, both paradigms onto the entire world. So I would like to just question you both about this idea of like, how do we work within a framework of justice without becoming, say, too far to the stereotypical cultural relativism, everything is right as long as it's somewhere, but also not going too far in the direction of, well, we have the right to enforce justice in places where, it just seems as though it exists in a different capacity, or there's historical reason why we should not believe that that's the goal of any particular Western culture. Sorry for going on there a little long, but so let's start with Kirsten.
Sure. Well, I kind of take like a holistic perspective of defining technology. And so I definitely see the law as technology. And so it sort of overlaps with this, concept of objectivity. And listeners of like Michael's show would know he had kind of like a suspicion of science. And I also share in this suspicion, just as it's being projected as something like a neutral, like a neutral discipline, and, the way in which it's affected other sort of social sciences, as it were, right? That, it immediately becomes a question of like, what constitutes knowledge, right? What constitutes like ways of knowing, who gets to decide what's knowledge. And this, I think, really is drawing on what Ramesh has said about, bottom-up conceptions of justice. So I think, this kind of inverting what constitutes a legitimate source of information is definitely part of that. To use like the fancy like word epistemology that, I think gets thrown around. We can see how the social sciences have tried to imitate the natural sciences. But, I've been studying political science for a decade, and so far as I can tell, there's like nothing, scientific about what goes on in it. And when you try to apply those scientific principles or methods to political phenomenon, you very quickly find yourself, in the realm of maybe creating a mathematical calculation to determine an acceptable number of civilian casualties with like a drone strike, or, calculating nuclear strike strategy with like game theory. And so it can be it's very kind of pernicive, I think, and potentially very dehumanizing. So kind of taking it a step further back and looking at like who's consulting, who's an expert, who gets to kind of speak to these issues is a way to kind of resist.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, these sorts of even our sort of languages as scholars or progressive scholars that we are taught, by which we are supposed to assess or look at or kind of describe movements toward justice, themselves are rooted in presumptuous, flattening language and models, right? And so, even when I'm sort of looking at some, when I'm sort of trained to look at some sort of social network analysis in relation to maybe some sort of technology that's been developed and its effect on, or its relationship to some sort of larger scale social movement, that language of analysis itself has often been fed to me. And remember, a lot of this stuff, and Kirsten just alluded to it, I totally agree, comes out of these kinds of conceptions of knowledge as something that could be static, representational, and fixed in particular types of classification systems. In reality, that's not how many people live. Even those of us who drink that Kool-Aid have practices by which we are, by which we relate, by which we act, that defy the sort of canons of science itself. So, when in our conversation last week, I referred to the philosopher Achille Mbembe, who's Cameroonian scholar, based at in Wits in Johannesburg, who's been influencing me quite a bit these days, just his work, where he sort of makes the argument that that sort of relationship that's pushed out by the Western canon itself of things, humans, and technologies, for example, as sort of discrete entities, is itself a sort of exporting of a model of being that itself is part of the colonial practice, right? That it's part of the colonial practice to say, this is how things are. This is what is, right? When in reality, many communities that I've worked with, have really defied that on every level. So, just back to what I've fieldwork, these stories are, I think, really important in kind of opening up our imagination of what actually is and what can be. So, communities I work with in the Sierra and Oaxaca are building their own collectively owned DIY cell phone networks, digital networks of all kinds. But how are they building it? Well, they're not doing it according to the canon of engineering and design know-how. They're rigging it, they're hacking it. These are communities where when children are born, when babies are born, the umbilical cords are hung from trees in the community, which might be kind of a graphic image for us to have to digest in the morning. But at the same time, it signifies that our bodies and this land are not distinct from one another. We are the land. The land is us. That is a kind of, if you will, a metaphysic approach that is really not part of the canon of science itself. So, so much of my work kind of explores digital technologies and the opportunities not only to transform the modes by which they're designed and created, but even understand what they signify and what they mean, right? In the image of what people are aspired toward, but also understanding, per Mbembe's work, that people and technologies and things are not necessarily just these kind of static entities. Our relationships with one another and our relationships even with technologies, these things are not simply user and tool, right? There's a kind of dynamic, there's something dynamic that's occurring in the ways people actually are. And so that is what I've observed in action all around the world. And it's kind of astonishing that we continue to believe particular models that are, that are kind of instrumental, even in the social sciences, and definitely, out of the hype that's pushed out by big technology corporations, which are the biggest corporations in the world because they've taken over everything, right? Taxis, accommodations, so on. They're all technology companies. We believe that hype, but in reality, what people actually do in their lives, their practices in their lives, open up this entire understanding. And for me, that's extremely heartwarming and inspiring. And the other model I just want to quickly refer to is not simply the Western canon, but the Chinese like techno-authoritarian model, which I think is very important to recognize when we talk about justice, at least in relation to what I do with technology. I think I mentioned last week, Brandon, I tried to kind of, not break in, but I tried to kind of trespass into multiple Chinese-owned mines in in the Congo and in Uganda, where coltan, which is in all of these phones, right? Which is just like lithium in Bolivia, these minerals are in these devices. So that's why we see the absence of justice or the kind of erosion of justice based on, for example, Chinese environmental activity and labor practices, for example. So I think it's important to understand that these are all models of commandment. These are all models that are being pushed onto actually the vast majority of people in the world.
No, absolutely. And I think it's important to even sort of, just not to break into the conversation as the host, but to situate that kind of model for understanding the world, within the history of colonialism, right? Because there is this kind of tracing back to that, this idea of like the Western culture as being able to act on the global South without having any kind of repercussions in terms of cultural influences, except for what they choose to, take in. And I feel, this idea of the person acting and the thing being acted upon as existing in two separate, multiple realities where they're not in tandem, or meaning is not being created, or rather new meaning is not being created by that activity or that synchronicity is, naive, right? We know our lives are being shaped by technology in ways that cannot even be, fully unpacked in this hour. And also we know our biology is being shaped in ways by technology that can't even, be unpacked in these hours. We're just finally starting to realize now, and not even the 5G causes, I don't know, bat coronavirus, but just, the ways in which we navigate the world, the ways in which we, feel comfortable engaging socially, or, our relationship with ourselves. But I bring that up because I think it's important, what Kirsten began her point broaching, the idea that in our last panel, our last part of this panel rather, I keep getting mistaken there, we had a very narrow definition of technology, but in many ways law is a type of technology too, once we sort of broaden that sort of scope outside of high tech Western definitions of digital and information and internet technology, back to sort of more Enlightenment ideals about like what modern society actually encompasses, and talk about law as infrastructure, law as technology, the roads as a form of technology. And sort of just to highlight that aspect of it, I think it allows for this narrative about Western and non-Western societies to exist that create these concepts of high and low class, or rather first and third world, and not in the sort of communist sense, but in the sort of developing and non-developing nations, right? Which is entirely devoid, as we've been talking about, this sort of cultural and contextual understanding of how cultures and societies and populations arise in their own places. And so, I mentioned that to sort of broach the topic of, how do we connect these ideas of technology to civilizations and progress, and how do we further sort of loop in that conversation about the law into technology? So how are we, finding ourselves still stratifying and creating these hierarchies of societies, of countries, based on outmoded ideas about, technology or, lawlessness or justice?
Yeah, if I can just jump in there, I would like to kind of use Ramesh's example of the mines to kind of, emphasize that we have, historical imperial practices and current neocolonial practices that, involved, extracting technologies, extracting raw materials, privatizing them, and in the process actually trying to actively deindustrialize that original location. So, it's simultaneously extracting ideas and materials so as to, help kind of build the imperial project, but also actively, taking these what are usually like public technologies, privatizing them, and literally trying to prevent access to those who originated them in the first place. And so we can see how that happens with minerals today, but we can also just see how that serves that broader narrative about high-tech places being somehow more progressive, more advanced, more civilized, and places that don't, have that technology as being somehow, temporally backwards, right? And, this is tied very closely, I think, in with technology fetishism and technology determinism. And as you said, Brandon, like these sort of Enlightenment ideas that, we're on like a progression as a civilization. And, the end point is what we're kind of aiming at, and it's going to be, very high tech, and it's going to be very just, and that, it will be peaceful, and that technology is going to help us get there. And so anything that is high tech is perceived as being, more kind of good and just. And so we can see how that technology is used to create and maintain these unequal economic relationships, but also simultaneously, serve those narratives. And if you look at the history of something like arms control, you see that these colonially administered territories were actually prevented from acceding to different treaties and agreements that were around particular types of weapons because they weren't considered to be part of the civilized world. And that meant not only were they excluded from joining, but that those weapons that were considered too inhumane to be used in the civilized world could be used there with abandon. So you can take as an example something like exploding bullets, right? There's some kind of very innately inhumane, if you can have a weapon that's more or less humane, those which are kind of recklessly indiscriminate and particularly harmful and maiming in their violence, those were considered to be acceptable to use in these kind of lower tech places.
Yeah, I would just jump in and say, that we've been fed this like false narrative, from Francis Fukuyama's End of History to, the kinds of proclamations we've seen, associated with a lot of our kind of our technology icons, right? And I asked the question last week, why is it that we essentially deify some strange characters like Elon Musk or I guess I had to bring him up, or Steve Jobs, as sort of countercultural, sort of figures who are divorced from really anything that they stand for outside of saying occasionally strange things, or in Jobs' case, maybe like taking acid and going to India as a white guy, and like, so the question for me is, that it like kind of all wrapped up in technology are not only fetishes as Kirsten just said, but sort of this kind of, it's sort of an empty signifier for some sort of imagination or outcome. It's an empty signifier though, right? Because we're seeing it crack all over us. We're seeing the wealthiest technologists invest in post-apocalyptic, like Dr. Strangelove type, like bunkers, this whole survivalist thing. We're seeing like, yo, we're out of here, we're going to Mars or what have you. I wrote a piece for Salon where I even like kind of quoted a line from Tribe Called Quest, which I grew up listening to, and Whitey on the Moon from Gil Scott-Heron, about sort of who is or is not included in these kind of future escapades. We're seeing ourselves being tethered more than ever to internet technologies as we sit through this pandemic and future pandemics that are likely to onboard. So we're seeing collapse. We're seeing collapse concurrent with the continued sort of imaginary and lionization of these particular icons, right? We don't really like name the names with great sort of social admiration of those running Goldman Sachs or our fossil fuel companies or big pharma, right? But they all have actually done the same thing, which is they've exploited the public interest, right? Like the public paid for the infrastructures like these roads right outside and the internet itself, which started at my university at UCLA. We paid for that, right? As Senator Sanders, whose campaign I was like so honored to be part of, said, privatize the profits, socialize the costs, right? That's the model. Or socialism for the 0.00001%, right? So I guess what I'm getting at here is, these cracks are more evident than ever, and you know, and this model by which, you know, kind of technology, these digital technologies, mobile technologies, etc., have you know, evolved. All the costs associated with them have become more visible and apparent than ever. And because the model, generally speaking, with all of kind of dominant industrial capitalism or post-industrial capitalism, is externalize all the costs, right? You know, dump it out into the African continent with electronic waste, exploit laborers in China or in Manila with content moderators, right? But now, as we see more and more that we have that this sort of model that promises some sort of liberatory imaginary and kind of built on some sort of like shallow libertarian kind of understanding of freedom, right, is actually making everyone less free. And so in that I you know, I'm an eternal optimist and dedicated to transformation in all forms. You know, I believe that in those collapses come new opportunities for new flowers to bloom. And there's my Buddhist self ranting, but like, you know, that's really like new seeds can spring, right? And so far from me being merely like a critic or a writer about this stuff, I'm seeing like in the space of journalism, like I'm able to like get these ideas out there more than ever before, including with like Jeff Bezos owned Washington Post, right? I'm hustling like multiple members of Congress, including people who are total like centrist military industrial complex type figures. And they're I'm not saying that they're absolved from all of that. They're implicated in all of that, but they're pushing some pretty progressive digital rights stuff that I'm kind of in their ear on. So I guess there's the kind of like interesting kind of pivot point that we're at here, right? Greater violence, greater colonialism, greater injustice, greater inequalities, yet the cracks and destructions of that system that proffered us freedom are becoming more apparent. So where do we go? That's the question.
I mean, that's a great question, right? And I think that you're right in the sense that I've been optimistic in seeing more and more people become critical of these, you know, let's just say broadly speaking, infrastructures that underpin not only our lives, but our inequality, right? Becoming more critical of like the law as a neutral technology, becoming more critical of the internet as a neutral technology. And in that critical, you know, in that criticism, in that ability, sort of that awakening to the flaws there, you know, where does that leave us on the left? And like, how do we sort of, I guess the question is, how do we use that sort of new burgeoning critique in these people's minds, or at least awareness of the problem, to sort of highlight issues that we've been sort of talking about for decades, right? Because the issues with technology as it exists, the issues with Elon Musk as he exists are not new, right? You know, I think there is a uniqueness to this problem. And it's sort of like its eccentricities. Elon Musk is weird. You know, he's a weird like emerald mine tycoon guy who's married to a pop star. But we've been dealing with that, I think, as a society for decades now, like rogue billionaires who have too much time and money on their hands. But, you know, I think that, you know, the question of how do we talk about now, but continue to draw these historical lineages, like with these technologies, with these inequalities, that doesn't just sort of stop with Facebook or Google, is my question, right? How do we, and I guess a good way to end it, how do we sort of draw this line, you know, between what was happening then to what's happening now, and sort of incorporate technology and justice into it? And, you know, how do we move forward in your minds? Or you can say whatever you want. That might be a bad question, but let's start with Ramesh.
Ooh, okay. There's so much. I think first of all, is to recognize that, for me, the vast majority of people, like in the United States where I live, but actually even in a greater sense on our planet, don't necessarily buy into or espouse these horrific sort of systems that have created the world within which we live, which is a beautiful and amazing world, but is highly compromised and is highly unjust, you know, when it comes to these issues. And that is something I honestly see everywhere I go. I see, and for me, a lot of it is just about understanding what are the transactions that we have bought into without even knowing, when we sort of participate in dominant, economic, social, political, and technological sorts of systems, and kind of like when we are part of those processes. So, I mean, I saw this with our campaign in this last round. We were, and Michael and I like vibed a lot. We talked a lot about this, and also like, when I was doing stuff with the Young Turks, which is kind of how we met originally, we were talking a lot about that. And when I'm talking that, I mean the Sanders campaign. That was not a fringe campaign. That was a campaign that was going to win the Democratic nomination if it didn't get knocked out by the DNC, or Obama particularly. So what I'm getting at is that there's a lot of interest in actual transformations that at least restore some greater balance with public interests. Public interest being not just the interests of some sort of bland, flattened Habermasian public, but a public, multiple publics, right? LGBTQ justice, immigrant rights justice, workers' justice, indigenous peoples' justice, right? Obviously, Black Lives Matter, right? At the forefront of it all, right? And so that's what people actually, I believe, want. And when we look at like categories like Medicare for all, those policies, I mean, it's absurd to, I'm speaking to a Canadian here, who's hardly in a progressive left country, and I'm talking about this as our left policy here in the U.S. I mean, Brandon, it's like, what the hell? But at the same time, people
ultra left
want
policy.
Huh?
It's our ultra left policy in the United States.
God help me, right? It's yeah, and so people want that, right? So I believe that what has to occur has to be, what I think we're all doing, which is trying to illustrate and describe like what are the transactions, what are the kind of the powers that be that are shaping our lives in the direction they are, and present alternative pathways. And even in my own realm of technology, right, as like someone who's a former engineer who kind of came up with, characters like Musk and others were like all around me. I mean, he's like several years older than me, but like I went to Stanford, and I know these kind of folks. And I went to MIT, right? Talk about military industrial complex right there, right? So like, I know, and I see that there are all sorts of other models by which we can think even about technology, right? Like we can decolonize AI systems. We can think about anti-surveillance sorts of models that we can move toward. We can think about models that involve like flexible technology infrastructures like Uber, Lyft, et cetera, but that are owned by workers, or that workers have greater equity. That was something that our campaign was pushing. We can recognize the environmental and labor externalities associated with technologies. There's so much we can do, right? And the models that I actually see being practiced by these different projects and initiatives that I've kind of looked at and worked with and collaborated with. I don't write about people, but I write about what they do and how they transform technology. Those models are extremely important, right? Collectivity as a model, right? Seeing technology as something that we all can have power over, and we can all design, and we can all monetize, right? So I guess I just want to say that what we need to do at a moment where collapse is right in front of us is use that as a kind of an anti-shock doctrine here, or like it's a shock doctrine, but shock doctrine to push toward a progressive direction, a people's-based direction. And here's our opportunity to do that. And part of that is to call out the same old hypocrisies and elitism that have always, kind of smoothed things over at moments of crisis.
Absolutely. And why don't we let Kirsten have the last word before we get out of here?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to kind of piggyback on a lot of what Ramesh just said, I think, we talk about being like a proverbial slave to technology, but, usually it's not the technology, right? It's its masters. And I believe, I'm not fatalistic about institutions or technologies. And I think that you can reimagine them in these alternative ways. And like a drone doesn't have like a baked in pre-given interest, right? And I know about Ramesh's idea of a kind of more democratized internet, a Bill of Rights, and sort of having some safeguards in those interactions we have with these platforms. And I think to kind of look at ways in which we can resist or reimagine these relationships, I can actually kind of just look out my door. So for instance, Foodora workers in Canada were successfully unionized. However, the minute that happened, Foodora packed up its operations here. So obviously, it's not gonna be super easy, but there was a huge drive to get that done here, and a lot of hard work, and it was very, very impressive. And likewise, there was the Sidewalk Labs project that was going to be just two kilometers south of where I currently am sitting in Toronto, started by Alphabet, Google's parent company. And it received a lot of pushback from, urbanist groups, privacy rights activists. The city itself it didn't seem comfortable giving up a lot of the kind of power, but information that Alphabet wanted, which is an interesting contrast to what I'm hearing is happening in Nevada potentially right now around these innovation funds. But, so these are, kind of more local ways of resisting, but obviously globally, it's going to look very different. And I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask a question, because I was reading some of your interviews this morning, and you had mentioned data bodies and the role that AI and algorithms play in determining subjectivities, how they take shape, and what happens to them. And I thought there was some really interesting parallels in both of our research here, because with something like drone strikes, you have a mediating effect of technology, and it tends to take on like two primary forms. So there's like a visual element, and then there's like kind of a more behavioral element. So the visual framing is through the gaze of a weapon. And this is something that Judith Butler has described as in her book Frames of War. And essentially, when someone is seen through a drone camera by an operator, they cease to be living persons. They kind of they are transformed into potential targets just by virtue of being seen through that frame. And so we can then imagine them as targets, and we can imagine them dying, and they almost become like a walking or living dead. And then on the behavioral side of things, you have that what are referred to as signature strikes by the American military. And that's essentially if someone checks certain boxes. So that could be exhibiting a particular pattern of life, which I think is, aptly named, that is considered suspicious and indicative that they might be like a terrorist or an insurgent. So that could be being male, of a certain age, gathering with other people, other men, carrying like a large object or tool that could be a weapon that the drone camera can't actually make out. And so if you live in like a rural place and you make a living through agricultural, production or rearing livestock, your everyday existence could involve gathering with people or community leaders and carrying equipment or tools. And that means that your pattern of life, your existence, is now considered dangerous to the degree that you are able to be targeted, right? And so this was sort of the life constituting and destroying aspects that I sort of see existing on a similar continuum in the way that, you've referred to in the past as, the predictive AI, policing, the AI in courtrooms, facial recognition, technology and security, as, having these very life creating and destroying efforts. And then on the other end, you have drones taking that to a much more kind of literal, intense version. Did I understand that correctly?
Oh my God, that was amazing. In some ways, so much more articulate than the way I feel like I sputter through that sometimes myself. I mean, much appreciation for like seeing my work in that way. Yeah, I mean, two quick things. One is, when we talk about drones, I was thinking about Josh Fox's documentary about Standing Rock and how it featured sort of this kind of counter activist, well, activist kind of counter power uses of drones. I thought that was pretty interesting. How some of the Standing Rock, were the protesters, the occupiers, the water protectors. I'm sorry, the protectors actually had drones that were monitoring, DHS and other sorts of policing activity and policing brutality. So that point that we can take these tools and use them to expose corruption, push greater transparency, it's always been a classical question associated with media and power. So I think I just want to mention that, and I totally love trying to think about that idea of decolonizing any technology, including drones, given that they're likely here to stay. Not sure I want that, but okay. Not okay, but like, let's decolonize it. Let's truly. So then as far as this point about data bodies and so on, I think that what's happening is, we all know this, is at all times, almost in all places, data is being collected about us without our knowledge, without our awareness of what is being collected, by whom, how that data is being retained. I think that's really important. So like data that might be collected about me when I was 18, should that be available to someone now, when I'm like 2 decades later, right? So that is, so in a sense, that is a mode of constructing sort of an entity as a target of various types of actions, right? Policing actions, racist actions, target literally in this case, as you mentioned, of someone to be killed by a drone strike, and the fact that we are all subjects of this sort of regime without understanding what's being collected, by whom, for how long, and how that data might even be aggregated, right? Like in the United States, I can buy everyone's credit card data. I mean, that's what shady organizations like Cambridge Analytica did, right? They bought people's credit card data and they aggregated it with, Facebook data or what have you, to create kind of a new sort of target, new forms of targeting. So the absence of our power over those practices and the ways those practices are being kind of embedded in different kinds of targeted computational systems that support various sorts of systems of power, whether they're killing systems or systems of, organizing the population to support your own private corporate interests, which basically means trying to cut labor out at all costs. So data bodies being gathered to train automated systems to wipe out laborers, and certainly their ability to organize, because they won't even be part of the system. Data bodies being used, gig workers as data bodies, right? Gig workers are essentially intermediate stages who data is being collected about them while they do whatever they do, so that it can be fed into other kinds of systems that could actually make them obsolescent and screw them over even more in a horrifically unequal system within which we live. So I really appreciate what you're saying. I mean, it's the idea of how we target, especially the most vulnerable, black and brown people, women of color in particular, are younger people. I mean, my students at UCLA, who I get along with great, who are so awesome and smart, I love them. They're all in massive amounts of student debt and are now driving for Postmates. And therefore they are data bodies for Postmates, and that's an extremely precarious form of labor, just as a random example. So having true sovereignty and power, and at the minimum, making completely transparent, auditable, and public interest being able to regulate these acts that are occurring, I think are extremely important. And the other thing is, some companies, and I know we emailed briefly about this, Kirsten, like to claim that they are like the pro-privacy companies. I'm talking about Apple here. And, I think that's it's kind of unbelievable or kind of rich that they say that, given that they have my thumbprint, which I rejected here, that they can scan my eyes. I'm wondering if like, are those biometric forms that are so specific to me as a human being that they have? Is that an example of them like supporting my privacy? And so really just don't buy it. I think it's just important that none of us buy the hype of how different kinds of organizations or companies in particular, or states, try to posture themselves in relation to these questions that are unsettling for us all around technology. And just last thing I'll say very briefly is the BBC filmmaker, Adam Curtis, has had an influence on me. I've been watching him for years, and his latest kind of movie just came out. And he makes the point that there are these certain models of human beings that feed upon their anxiety and that recursively reinforce and amplify their anxiety. And those are sorts of systems that treat us in a totally incorrect and inaccurate way as individual self-maximizing people who are actually competing with one another and will always choose our best interests, even if it means screwing other people over. I don't think people are like that. I know people are not like that. I've seen that people are not like that. I'm not like that. None of us are like that. So these BS models have ended up recursively being encoded into many types of economic, social, and technological systems that then have feedback loops in influencing us. And that's why so many people feel so much anxiety about what's going on, right? So I ask the question in my work, and I'm determined to continue to ask that question of what would a transformational emancipatory logic look like that can guide everything from drones to AI systems and so on, if we are to even have them at all. I really appreciate that. Thanks for asking that question or making those comments, Kirsten.
Well, I think that's a great way to end it. Why don't we finish out by letting everyone by you two letting everyone know where they can keep up with your work. Ramesh, let's start with you since I know you have to leave.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I have to leave so soon. I have a website. it's long. My last name's long. RameshSrinivasan.org. So y'all can definitely check out what I'm up to there. I'm doing a lot of media these days, and so I have like links to articles I'm writing, or I'm doing stuff with journalists. There are some of the latest stuff that I think is kind of interesting is like, there's various bills that are floating around Congress that I've kind of helped these folks like author, or just not author, but because these bills are really, I don't want to write them, but like kind of helped advise a little bit, that are trying to rein in things like Section 230, which let content providers just get away with everything. Obviously, the internet should be a space for totally radical free speech of all forms, but they should not be able to manipulate and make white supremacy like the dominant thing there. So anyway, I'm rambling, but that's a great way to just stay in contact with me. And then I'm on Twitter. I'm not that active on it, but people keep telling me I should be more. And my handle is Ramesh Media, RameshMedia. And I just want to say also how much love and appreciation I have for Michael Brooks, who was so unique and is, I think he lives within me, as a progressive person involved in the media. He was thinking about these questions of decolonization. He was thinking actively about the global South. I remember watching his interview with Lula. That was pretty amazing. He was the man. He was really trying to think way beyond a lot of these strictures that I think, unfortunately, because of all our craziness in this country, a lot of us in the progressive community we constantly are trying to push back, this challenge, this challenge, this challenge, this fight, this fight, this fight. Michael was thinking in a far broader and emancipatory way. And what an ally to a scholar like myself. So in memory.
Absolutely. Michael's legacy can never be truly encompassed, even in another 1,000 of these panels. But hopefully we were able to do it some justice. Kirsten, why don't you take us out with telling the people how they can keep up with your work?
I'm actually, hoping to find work sometime in the next year or so. So I've been keeping a lower profile, you might say. But, I am working on co-authored working paper right now that will be published through the Defense and Security Insight Group at Waterloo University in Canada, and it's on a comparative analysis of Canadian American counterterrorism policy. So if people are very interested in those things, you could probably find it there. Otherwise, I would just wrap things up by saying that, yeah, I mean, Michael, one of his greatest, gifts is bringing people together. And I think that this is a great, example of that. And, a lot like Ramesh said, I think that, I try to think about what would Michael say when I encounter a new topic or a new issue. And I remember the day that I, learned that he passed, my partner read this wonderful quote from a Canadian philosopher to me that was, to paraphrase, is that, we continue these conversations with our friends inside of ourselves long after they're gone. And so I like to think that conversation is still going. And it was just such an honor and pleasure to be here with all of you and on, recognizing and honoring Michael's legacy and his work.
Absolutely. And it was wonderful getting together with you two as well. And thank you all for joining us for this 2-part technology and justice panel. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you all for your time.